Hello again, ladies and gents. Hopefully that was fast and frenetic, but gave you a good opportunity to get around the room and speak to other attendees before we get into today's guest speaker, and then we'll get back into the room where you can follow up those conversations in a more sort of informal manner. So I do want to go into our guest speaker today for the next 15 minutes or so as I introduce Sarah Williams up onto the screen. And Sarah has spent years working in banking, having then quit to go traveling, climb Kilimanjaro, did a number of other challenges, set up a podcast called the Tough Girl Podcast. Is one of the leading podcasts out there, interviewing a number of different successful females across the world. Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Yes, excited to be here.
Good. Thank you for joining us. And just to mention to anyone out there that if you want to submit any questions, on the right-hand side, along from the chat box, you'll see the Q&A area. Feel free to pop any in there, whether it's about podcasting in general, whether it's about any of the challenges Sarah's done that we might touch on, but feel free to ask any, and I'll pick them up as we go or at the end. But Sarah, there's a number of places we could start this conversation, but I think given the audience, a lot of business people in the room from various backgrounds, you yourself were in the rat race, let's say, in banking in the city, and you made that jump to go traveling and then started the podcast, which you now do full time. Just give us a quick snapshot into that whole period of time and what your mindset was like making that decision.
So I worked in banking, private wealth management for 8 years, got to 32, and I was thinking, this cannot be my life. I was working, as you probably all do, 15, 16 hours a day. I was addicted to my BlackBerry. I was waking up stressed in the middle of the night, worrying about if things had happened, things hadn't happened. And I was in a very fortunate position. I had some savings behind me. So I left, headed off traveling. And it was when I was over in South America, I finally got some time to think about what it is that I wanted to do with my life. And so I thought, well, my passions and interests are travel and adventure, but also motivating and inspiring women and girls. So when I came back to England, I set up my company called Tough Girl Challenges. And initially it was going to be a blog, and I was going to write about my life and my experiences, and everyone was going to read it. I was going to change the world. Nobody read my blog, not even my mum, because she's not technical. So the whole blogging thing didn't really work out, but I was still giving, motivational talks in lots of girls' schools. And I was part of a mastermind group. And, this is going back sort of 6 years ago. And somebody said to me, why don't you start a podcast? And my initial response was, what's a podcast? Just not technical. But then I started listening to podcasts, and I started getting into them, and I started to understand the power of the podcast and the medium as a whole. And so I thought, actually, this is an incredible format for me to interview other women, to help them to share their stories and to share their voices. And so that's what I started doing on the 4th of August, 2015, 5 years ago. I started producing, one episode per week on a very, very consistent basis. It took me 5 days to reach 100 downloads. It took me 6 months to reach 25,000 downloads. It took me a year to reach 100,000 downloads. And then a couple of years later, through three or 4 years later, I reached 1 million downloads, which happened in December last year. But I suppose what I really want to talk about is actually the benefits of podcasting and the power that it's had and what it's done for me. So when I sort of changed in industries into sort of the adventure world, I was coming from zero. So I didn't have a social media following. I didn't have a network. I didn't have sort of colleagues. I didn't know other people doing what I was doing. But through the podcast, I've had these incredible conversations with women all around the world in the adventure field. So it's not only built up my own network, it's opened up massive doors. It's opened up opportunities for me with brands and sponsorship, because the best thing in the world is when you're having to reach out to a sponsor is when you don't even have to sell yourself. So you're going on the phone call and straight away they go, oh my goodness, I love your podcast. And they know who you are because you've been in their head speaking to them for the past couple of years. And so that is an incredibly powerful platform. And what I just sort of say is, I think you've got 3 platforms that you can go down. You can either have, the blogging, you've got the video, and then you've got podcasting. But podcasting can actually lead into both of those other things, because you can end up repurposing the content. So a podcast, you can repurpose that into blog posts, and you can repurpose it into smaller content for social media. And equally, you can also share it on YouTube as a platform as well. So quite a lot of people now, they may not necessarily know how to listen to podcasts, but they know how to work YouTube. So sorry, I don't know if you want this more of a question and answer.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
like,
No, you're leading into that question that I was going to say for businesses. And this period of time is really, I think the world as wife has really started to get into podcasts, whether that's starting themselves or on their morning walk or whatever it may be. I think podcasts have started to see a surge. As I think there's two sides of it really, because a lot of businesses may have considered starting a podcast. So we'll go down that route first. And then secondly, we'll go down the route of how businesses can utilize podcasts perhaps within their industry and their field as another arm to their marketing, because there's a lot to be said about appearing on podcasts and that sort of thing. So firstly, starting a podcast. If I was a business, and I don't have a podcast, but if I was a business, and I'm sure there's a lot out there that have maybe considered starting a podcast, where would be the good place to start? And what have you learned having set it up that you would do it all again if you could have your time?
I'd say it does seem really quite overwhelming when you start getting into the nitty gritty of it. But actually, technology has changed a huge amount now in terms of like there's just so many lower barriers to entry. If you've got a laptop or even if you've just got a mobile phone, there's a great app called Anchor where you can record into your mobile phone. And especially if you've got an iPhone or a smartphone, the quality that you can get is pretty amazing. And then all the platforms around editing, so you can edit on platforms like Audacity, can end up being free. So the main costs are around the media hosting. But what I would say is I think it's a huge benefit to businesses at the moment to get into podcasting. I mean, it would be absolutely perfect for your business. I mean, even if you just did 15-minute conversations with your guests, or even you could repurpose the interviews that you do for your networking club and release them later as a podcast. It's just extra content to share. It's going to add more value to your business as well at the same point. I think the hardest thing is what happens is it can take time to grow an audience. So you're not going to grow an audience overnight. And a lot of people end up getting frustrated. So what they say is most people will start a podcast, but within 6 episodes, they will have given up because they haven't started to see the returns that can come from it. But if you are very, very consistent and very, very patient, the payoff will, I think, really be huge, because podcasting still hasn't had that mainstream surge yet. I mean, even what I've noticed from speaking to guests today is, 5 years ago when I was attending networking events and talking about podcasting, I was actually having to physically explain what a podcast is. Whereas now most people, they've heard of it. They've either listened to a couple of episodes, they understand what I'm talking about. And so I still think it hasn't become fully mainstream, but with the development of things like Google Home and Alexa, voice is going to become even more powerful. Editing, I would just say this, editing is time consuming. I'm a one-woman show. I do it all myself. But if you're a business and you've got the funds to do it, then you can outsource all of this. So you basically got 2 options. You can do it on a shoestring budget and make good quality content. But if you're a larger business, you can also outsource that and pay. You can just do the fun stuff like the interviewing and pay somebody else to do the editing, uploading the files, sharing it on social media. And it is an incredible way to grow your business.
Yeah, I really like the idea of repurposing content, because a lot of people think that, I'll just write a blog or I'll just do a video, and they're great. But I think what you just touched on there is taking that sound from the video and maybe repurposing it into a podcast, because it is all down to personal preferences. And I like, if I'm out running, sometimes I'll listen to a podcast, or if I'm in a journey in the car for more than half an hour, I'll probably put on a podcast. And I think it's all down to personal preference. But if you've got that content that's maybe in video format, people can't engage with that when they're in those situations. So the other side of it, as I touched on, is if there's businesses out there that perhaps go, well, starting a podcast isn't relevant to me, it's not something I want to use my time to do. How can people leverage podcasts, to keep raising their brand, share their expertise? Where would be a good place for people to start, given the fact there's a real range of industries here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, so start by doing your research. There will probably be a podcast out there on your niche. And if there isn't, then you can actually obviously start one. I would highly recommend it. But when you're being a guest on somebody else's podcast and sharing your story, you're not only going to improve your public speaking ability, you're going to have somebody else promoting you as a leading expert in your industry. It's more content for your website, for your blog, for whatever it is that you're doing. And it is a brilliant way. If you've been trying to get in contact with, being a guest on it, you can share your knowledge. It helps to get it helps people to get to know you better. So one of the big things that podcasts do is through hearing their voices in your ear and in your head, it builds up this high level of trust with people. And it's also podcast. A lot of people with video, for example, they'll turn off after a couple of minutes, they'll lose interest, they'll just skim a blog post. But in terms of the actual engagement that podcast listeners get, is they are more likely to listen to the very, very end of a podcast. So there is a lot of benefits from that whole process of collaboration and, you know, being a guest in your area. And plus, in terms of efficiencies and how you use your time, you know, I had a friend last week who I was speaking to, and she has got herself booked on, I think, 10 podcasts over the past week to be interviewed on. Now, the great thing is that's an hour of her time, which, you know, is a little bit of time, but then what she has afterwards, you've got 10 other individuals, 10 other companies who are then promoting you out to their networks. And so it will end up coming back to you in the long run. I mean, I remember I used to go and do radio interviews, and by the time I got, you know, dressed up, driven there half an hour, done the 10-minute chat, and then left, it was basically my whole morning was gone. Whereas actually my morning could be spent just doing, you know, 3 or 4 podcast episodes for other people. And it's amazing what can come off that, because I've had, you know, lots of listeners finding my podcast because they've heard me on other podcasts. I've had opportunities to be, you know, a keynote speaker over in America because people have heard me on the podcast. So it helps you to build your own personal brand. It's going to add value to your business. And what I would say as well is, if you do start your own podcast, say there's somebody that you've been trying to speak to who's maybe a senior manager or a senior leader, or somebody who you just can't get a meeting with. If instead of just trying to go for the meeting, you're asking, hey, I'd love to hear about your story. How did you get to where you go? I'd love for you to share your tips and tricks. That person is going to be flattered and think, oh, well, you know, I love talking about myself. Why not? You end up having a 20-minute conversation, half an hour conversation. You're building rapport through that time when you're interviewing them. It builds a relationship with them. And so further down the line, when actually you want to reach out to discuss doing business together, you've already got that foundation on which you can build on.
Absolutely. And as you say, there's pretty much a podcast for everything out there, and a good place for people to look for that is obviously through the podcast app on Apple, or just generally online. I guess is probably the best place to start. And then is it a case of maybe just contacting those people and saying, look, I'm here if you want to have a conversation about a specific subject or talk about what you are talking about. I'm happy to share my thoughts, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you can. I mean, what a lot of people do is create a little pitch document, have a think through, you know, what's your background, what's your story, what are the topics that you can talk on with authority. And then it's a case of, you know, take a listen to the podcast first, see what the format is, reach out to those individuals. Hey, I've been, you know, maybe, hey, whatever you want to say. But, you know, I've been listening to your podcast. This is my background. This is where I can add value to your audience. I'd love to be a guest if you think it would be appropriate. Please contact me. You know, do a little bit of research beforehand. There's no harm in asking. I mean, what I do before you even get to that stage is just make sure you do the basics. I'd follow them all on social media. I'd retweet them a little bit if they've got any content out there on blogs or LinkedIn. You know, engage with that content so they sort of know who you are. You know, everyone likes to be recognized, so that's almost a few of the basics. So then when you reach out to them, you can say, oh, hi, my name's Tough Girl. You may have seen me on Twitter. I've loved sharing your content. This is where I think I can help you.
Yeah, it's not just a cold introduction. It warms it up a little bit, for sure.
Yeah.
Something that I've seen recently through a blog and an email newsletter that I subscribe to is, again, back to the sort of repurposing the content, is they would write a blog. This is it's a memberships related newsletter, but they write the blog, and then the person that's wrote it will typically record it and then have it as a sound bite at the bottom, that if people just would rather listen to it for 10 minutes rather than read it for 15 minutes or something, they can do that. So it's another idea that I saw. There's a question that's come in from Richard Hodson. Are there any major no-nos on a podcast, i.e. boring subjects, etc.? What would you say?
No, not at all. And I think boring subjects are completely relative. So if you work in insurance or wills or something, or tax or something, you know, which other people consider boring, people in your niche, people in your industry will be fascinated by your discussions about it. And this is also the great thing about podcasting, is there's no sort of set format. So you can mix it up. You can do solo episodes. You can have a co-host. It can be very formal. You could say have standardized questions that you ask the same guest. You might have the same 10 questions. It can be 3 hours long. It can be 10 minutes long. You can play about with it to see what works. But if you are passionate and interested about your subject, whatever it may be, there will be other people in the world who are also equally as passionate about that subject, no matter what it is. So there is no such thing as a boring subject.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And what's next for the Tough Girl podcast, Sarah? Because we haven't touched on your challenges, and we probably won't have time to now, because the podcasting topic is very relative at this point in time, and it's going to be something that people can take something away from today, which is great. But so what's next for the Tough Girl podcast? You've hit your 1 million downloads. You're in over 175 countries. What's next?
Well, to be honest, so I normally go out and travel and do these big adventures. So I spent, last year I was 3 months cycling from Vancouver in Canada all the way down to Cabo San Lucas in Mexico. And I spent 3 months over in America through hiking the Appalachian Trail, walking 2,190 miles in 100 days. So obviously travel is off the cards for me at the moment. So I'm having to focus on what I can control and what I can do. So I'm doubling up my production. So new episodes of the Tough Girl podcast come out on a Tuesday. I'm now releasing 2 episodes basically twice a week. So I'm just like, that is all I can do at the moment. I mean, that's a huge workload, but at least I am helping to motivate and inspire people who may be feeling a little bit frustrated that they can't go out traveling, they can't go out and do their adventures. In terms of the podcast, for me, it is about increasing the amount of female role models. It's about sharing more stories. I wish I could produce more content, but this is sort of my maximum at the moment. I just want to continue seeing it grow and see where it takes it. Numbers are great, and obviously I want to hit 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. But that also comes back to ego. The better thing for me is when I get messages from my listeners saying, Sarah, because of you, I've gone on to sign up for that ultra marathon. I've quit my job and decided to go backpacking around the world. This is obviously, pre-COVID, and share the stories that have changed their life. I've also had women reaching out saying, I've just started my couch to 5K, and I've just got that old exercise bike out of the garage, and I've got back on it every single day. So that's my focus at the moment. I think it's very difficult to plan that much for the future.
No, absolutely. And last question would be, for those that haven't listened to the podcast, what would be your standout show, or what's the best traction you've got from a show, best engagement that people can go and find from the Tough Girl podcast to get them going?
Oh my goodness, that's such a difficult question. I'll say one of the most popular episodes is like my episode, but I don't want to share that one. There's a great podcast. So I spoke with this amazing woman called Rosie Swale Pope. She's 73 years young, and Rosie lost her partner in her 50s, and she decided to go for a little run around the world, pulling this cart behind her. And most recently, last year, she was actually running from Brighton in the UK all the way over to Kathmandu in Nepal. So she got as far as Turkey, which is where I ended up meeting up with her in December. And Rosie has the most amazing stories, the most incredible attitude, this way of looking at the world and the way of looking at life that is just inspiring. And even though I did the interview and edited the interview and put it out, I decided to re-listen to that episode when I was on a train, and I was so engrossed I hadn't actually realized that the train had stopped and that I hadn't actually got off the train yet, because I ended up sitting there for like a further 10 minutes just so enthralled by her story. So definitely take a listen to Rosie Swale Pope. She's incredible. But what I think you can always find something from the episodes, just one little nugget, one little gem that you'll be able to apply to your own life.
Fantastic. Great. Well, Sarah, we've come to the end, but I really appreciate your time, and we'll share the details of the Tough Girl podcast. I'm sure people have taken away a nugget of inspiration, whether it's starting their own podcast or even appearing on podcasts. And I'm sure my colleague Anders is going to hate me when I start suggesting about how we can repurpose all this content. Absolutely. But thank you very much for being with us, Sarah, and do stick around if you can, and I'm sure people will be keen to chat. So thanks very much, Sarah.
No problem.
Thank you very much to Sarah. And now we'll get back into